At 62 years old, Michael sat alone at his kitchen table. The house was quiet, too quiet. The same house that had once echoed with the sounds of children running through the hallway now felt strangely empty. His coffee had gone cold. Outside the window, the morning sun was beginning to rise, painting the neighborhood in soft shades of gold. But Michael barely noticed. His eyes were fixed on an old photograph. In the picture, he was 35, strong, confident, certain. His shoulders were broader. His smile came more easily, and his eyes carried something he could no longer recognize. Expectation. For a long moment, he stared at that younger version of himself. Then a familiar thought appeared. Where did he go? The question felt heavier than it should have, because deep down, Michael wasn't really asking about his appearance. He wasn't asking about wrinkles. He wasn't asking about gray hair. He was asking something much deeper. What happened to the man who believed there was still plenty of time? The truth was uncomfortable. His children had grown up. His career no longer excited him. His body needed more rest than it used to, and every year seemed to move faster than the last. Sometimes it felt as though life had quietly shifted into a chapter he never agreed to enter. Perhaps you know this feeling. Perhaps you've looked into the mirror and felt surprised by the face looking back at you. Not because it was old, but because it seemed unfamiliar. You remember who you used to be. You remember your energy, your dreams, your certainty, and without realizing it, you begin comparing your life today with a version that exists only in memory. This is where suffering begins. Not with age, not with time, not with the body, but with attachment. More than 2,500 years ago, the Buddha spoke about a truth that most people spend their entire lives avoiding. Everything changes. Everything. The body changes. Relationships change. Careers change. Identities change. Even the person you call me changes from moment to moment. Yet the human mind quietly resists this reality. It whispers, "This shouldn't be happening. I should still be the person I used to be. My best years should not be behind me." And that resistance creates pain. Not because life is cruel, but because we are asking reality to stand still. Imagine trying to stop a river with your bare hands. The harder you push against the current, the more exhausted you become. Time is that river. And after 50, many people spend enormous amounts of energy fighting a battle they cannot win. But what if aging is not the problem? What if getting older is not the tragedy? What if the real tragedy is refusing to become who this stage of life is asking you to become? Michael didn't know it yet, but the photograph in his hands was about to teach him something his younger self could never have understood. Something far more valuable than youth. Something stronger than ambition. Something that can only be discovered after life has humbled you enough to finally listen. And perhaps, tonight, it may teach the same lesson to you. Hashtag part 2. The man he could no longer be. For the next few days, Michael could not stop thinking about that photograph. It stayed on the kitchen table. Every morning he looked at it. Every evening he looked at it again. At first, he believed he was simply remembering, but slowly he realized something deeper. He was comparing the man he was now to the man he had once been. And every comparison ended the same way. He lost. The younger Michael always seemed stronger, more confident, more ambitious, more alive. At least that was the story his mind kept telling him. One afternoon, while cleaning out an old closet, he found a dusty cardboard box. Inside were pieces of another life. Work awards, business cards, old journals, letters, photographs. Evidence of a man who once believed success would bring permanent happiness. Michael sat on the floor and began sorting through them. At first he smiled. Then something unexpected happened. The memories became uncomfortable. He remembered the promotions, But he also remembered the stress. He remembered the achievements. But he also remembered the sleepless nights. He remembered being admired. But he also remembered feeling exhausted. For years, he had edited his own past. He had kept the highlights and forgotten the cost. And suddenly, a strange realization appeared. Maybe the younger version of himself had not been as happy as he remembered. Maybe memory was telling only half the story. The Buddha taught that the mind creates illusions, not because it wants to deceive us, but because it clings to what feels familiar. The past becomes polished. The painful edges become smooth. The difficult chapters fade away. And eventually we begin worshiping a version of ourselves that never truly existed. Michael sat quietly. A photograph rested in one hand, an old journal in the other. The journal was from when he was 38. One page caught his attention. The handwriting was hurried, almost desperate. It read, "I keep telling myself that once I reach the next level, everything will finally feel easier." Michael stared at the words. Then he laughed softly, not because it was funny, because it was painfully familiar. He had spent decades believing happiness was waiting somewhere ahead. The next promotion, the next raise, the next accomplishment, the next chapter. Yet here he was, decades later, still searching, still waiting, still telling himself that peace existed somewhere else. The realization felt heavy, but strangely liberating. For the first time, he saw something clearly. He was not grieving his youth. He was grieving an identity, the identity of being important, the identity of being needed, the identity of being successful, the identity of being the man everyone expected him to be. And that identity was disappearing. Not because life was cruel, because life changes. Just as summer becomes autumn, just as daylight becomes evening, just as a river never remains the same from one moment to the next. Everything moves. Everything transforms. Everything eventually becomes something new. Yet the human mind resists. It says, stay the same. Remain who you were. Do not change. But life never agrees. That evening, Michael took a walk through the neighborhood. The air was cool. The streets were quiet. As he walked, he noticed something he had never paid attention to before. The trees. Some were young. Some were ancient. Some stood tall and full. Others were bent and weathered. Yet none of them seemed ashamed of their age. The older trees did not apologize for their twisted branches. They did not wish to become saplings again. They simply stood where they were, rooted, present, complete. Michael stopped beneath one of the oldest trees in the park. Its trunk was scarred by decades of storms. Its branches stretched in every direction. And suddenly a question entered his mind. What if I'm not supposed to become younger? What if I'm supposed to become wiser? The question felt almost shocking, because for years he had treated aging as a problem to solve, a battle to fight, a decline to fear. But what if it was a transition, a different season, a different purpose, a different kind of strength? The Buddha taught that suffering arises when we cling to forms that are already changing. And perhaps that was exactly what Michael had been doing. Clinging to the man he used to be, clinging to the expectations he once carried, clinging to a version of life that no longer existed. The truth was difficult, but it was also freeing. The man he had been at 35 was gone. The man he had been at 45 was gone. The man he had been at 55 was gone, and no amount of wishing could bring them back. But something else was possible, something far more important. He could stop looking backward. He could stop measuring himself against ghosts. He could stop carrying yesterday into every new day. And perhaps, for the first time in many years, he could begin meeting himself exactly as he was. Not younger, not older, simply here. Simply alive. As the sun disappeared below the horizon, Michael continued walking. For the first time in a long while, he was not thinking about who he used to be. He was wondering who he might still become. And that small shift changed everything. Hashtag part 3, the weight of regret. That night, Michael slept better than he had in weeks. Not perfectly, but differently. The endless mental noise seemed quieter. The familiar battle between who he was and who he used to be had softened. Yet another challenge remained, perhaps the heaviest one of all: regret. It arrived the next morning while he was sitting alone on his porch. The sky was pale blue. Birds moved between the trees. The world seemed peaceful, but inside his mind, old memories were waking up. A business opportunity he never pursued. A relationship he should have fought harder to save. The years he spent working instead of being present. The conversations he never had. The risks he never took. One memory led to another, and another, and another. Soon Michael found himself traveling backward through decades of his life. As though somewhere in the past there was a missing piece he needed to find, a mistake he needed to fix, a different choice that would somehow explain everything. The mind has a strange habit. It believes suffering can be solved by replaying old events, as if enough analysis could change what has already happened, as if enough guilt could rewrite history. But history never changes. Only our relationship with it does. The Buddha understood this deeply. He taught that attachment is not limited to possessions. You can become attached to memories, attached to old wounds, attached to regrets, attached even to pain. Many people carry the past the way a traveler carries heavy stones, year after year, decade after decade, never realizing they are free to set them down. Michael looked across the street and watched an elderly man walking his dog. The man appeared relaxed, unhurried, content, and Michael wondered something. Had this man made fewer mistakes? Had he somehow lived a perfect life? Of course not. No one reaches old age without scars. No one. Everyone loses something. Everyone fails somewhere. Everyone disappoints someone. Everyone carries stories they wish had ended differently. The difference is not the mistakes. The difference is what happens afterward. Some people spend their lives staring at closed doors. Others turn around and notice the doors that are still open. Michael slowly realized that regret had become one of his daily rituals. Not meditation, not gratitude, not awareness. Regret. Each morning his mind searched for evidence of what had gone wrong. Each evening it replayed scenes that could never be changed. And every replay carried the same hidden message. You should have known better. You should have done more. You should have become more. The word should appeared everywhere, like an invisible prison. But something unusual happened that afternoon. Michael found an old notebook and began writing. Not about achievements, not about goals, simply about mistakes. He filled several pages. The failed business, the broken relationships, the years wasted chasing approval, the moments he acted from fear, the opportunities he ignored. At first it felt painful, then something shifted. For the first time, he wasn't defending himself. He wasn't justifying. He wasn't pretending. He was simply looking honestly. And as he looked, a surprising truth emerged. Many of the mistakes he hated most had also taught him the most. The failed business taught humility. The heartbreak taught compassion. The financial struggles taught discipline. The disappointments taught patience. The losses taught gratitude. Without those experiences, he would not be the man he was today. The realization stopped him. For years, he had treated his mistakes as enemies. But what if they had been teachers? What if the pain had not been meaningless? The Buddha often taught that suffering can become wisdom when it is observed clearly. Not avoided, not worshipped, observed. Most people either run from pain or drown inside it. Few sit quietly enough to learn from it. Michael looked down at the pages he had written. The list seemed less frightening now. The mistakes were still real. The consequences were still real, but they no longer felt like life sentences. They felt like chapters, finished chapters, and that distinction mattered, because a chapter is not the entire book. The sun began lowering in the sky. Long shadows stretched across the yard. Michael closed the notebook and sat quietly. A gentle breeze moved through the trees. For several minutes, he simply listened. No analysis, no replying, no arguments with the past. Just listening, just breathing, just being. And in that silence, another truth appeared. Perhaps the greatest mistake was not what he had done years ago. Perhaps the greatest mistake was continuing to punish himself for it. The past had already taken enough. Why keep giving it more? The Buddha taught that every moment is new. Every breath, every step, every sunrise. Life is constantly beginning again. Yet regret convinces us that we must remain loyal to old suffering, that we must carry it forever. But what if we don't? What if forgiveness is not weakness? What if forgiveness is simply the willingness to stop fighting a battle that ended long ago? As evening settled over the neighborhood, Michael stood from his chair. Something inside him felt lighter, not because the past had changed. The past remained exactly as it was, but because he was finally beginning to loosen his grip on it. And for the first time in many years, he understood something deeply. His future would never be built by replaying yesterday. It would only be built by showing up fully today. One breath, one choice, one step at a time. And perhaps that was enough. Perhaps it had always been enough. Hashtag part 4, the power of small disciplines. A week passed, then another. Nothing dramatic happened. No sudden breakthrough. No moment of enlightenment. No miraculous transformation. And yet something was changing. Slowly, quietly, almost invisibly. Michael began waking up 15 minutes earlier each morning. Not because he felt motivated. Most days he didn't. In fact, many mornings he wanted to stay in bed. The familiar voice still appeared. Tomorrow will be better. You can start later. One more day won't matter. But another voice had begun growing stronger. A calmer voice. A steadier voice. It simply said, "Get up." No arguments. No speeches. No emotional excitement. Just action. For most of his life, Michael believed change began with motivation. He thought successful people felt inspired. He imagined disciplined people woke up full of energy and certainty. Now he was discovering something entirely different. The people who changed their lives were not necessarily more motivated. They were simply more consistent. The Buddha never promised transformation through occasional effort. He taught practice, daily practice, repeated practice, patient practice. A monk does not meditate once and become peaceful. A musician does not practice once and become skilled. A gardener does not plant seeds once and expect a harvest the next morning. Growth requires repetition. Michael had spent years waiting to feel ready. Ready to exercise. Ready to improve his finances. Ready to start new projects. Ready to become healthier. Ready to become happier. But readiness never seemed to arrive. And now he understood why. Action creates readiness, not the other way around. One morning, he decided to walk around the neighborhood. Only 10 minutes. Nothing ambitious. Nothing impressive. 10 minutes. The following day, he walked again. Then again. Then again. After 2 weeks, the walks became easier. After a month, they became routine. After 2 months, he began looking forward to them. The change was subtle, but undeniable. His energy improved. His mood stabilized. His sleep became deeper. Not because of one extraordinary decision, because of dozens of ordinary ones. That realization fascinated him. For decades, he had underestimated small actions. He believed major change required major effort. Yet life seemed to follow a different law. Small actions repeated consistently became powerful. Very powerful. One evening while reading, Michael came across a simple Buddhist teaching. A pot is filled drop by drop. He closed the book and smiled. Such a simple sentence. It explained almost everything. Health improves drop by drop. Wisdom grows drop by drop. Confidence returns drop by drop. Peace develops drop by drop. And unfortunately, suffering works the same way. Neglect accumulates. Avoidance accumulates. Excuses accumulate. Years earlier, Michael had not become exhausted overnight. He became exhausted one neglected habit at a time, one stressful decision at a time, one unhealthy choice at a time. Likewise, rebuilding would happen the same way, not through intensity, through consistency. This understanding changed how he viewed his life. He stopped chasing dramatic transformations. He stopped creating impossible plans. He stopped trying to fix everything at once. Instead, he focused on one day, one habit, one choice, one step. Every morning he walked. Every evening, he spent a few quiet minutes reflecting instead of scrolling endlessly through news and social media. Every week, he simplified one small part of his home. Every day, he practiced being present during ordinary moments. A cup of coffee, a conversation, a sunset, a walk. Simple things, things he once overlooked. Gradually, something unexpected began happening. He started trusting himself again. For years, his confidence had depended on achievements, promotions, recognition, success. Now confidence was emerging from something much deeper. Integrity, the simple act of doing what he said he would do, even when nobody was watching, even when no rewards appeared, even when progress felt slow. Perhaps especially then. The Buddha taught that character is built through repeated action, not through intention alone. Anyone can intend to change. Few people practice long enough to transform. Michael thought about how often he had abandoned himself in the past. Promises made, promises broken, goals started, goals forgotten, dreams delayed. Each broken promise had weakened trust. Not trust in others, trust in himself. Now, every small act of discipline repaired that relationship, a little at a time, like rebuilding a bridge plank by plank. One afternoon, while resting on a park bench, Michael watched a young man jogging. The young man moved quickly, powerfully, effortlessly. Years ago, seeing him might have triggered comparison, maybe even envy. But something was different now. Michael simply smiled. The young man possessed youth. That was true. But Michael possessed something else. Patience, perspective, awareness. And for the first time, he realized those qualities had value. Real value. The world often celebrates speed, but speed is not always strength. A river cuts through stone not because of force, because of persistence, because it keeps moving, day after day, year after year, without drama, without stopping, without needing applause. Perhaps life worked the same way. Perhaps rebuilding after 50 was not about becoming extraordinary. Perhaps it was about becoming consistent. As the weeks continued, Michael noticed another change. His mind was becoming quieter, not silent, but quieter. The endless urgency that once dominated his thoughts had softened. He no longer felt desperate to catch up, no longer felt trapped by what he had not accomplished, no longer felt pressured to prove himself. Instead, he focused on today's actions, today's choices, today's opportunities. And strangely enough, that made him more productive than ever. Because energy was no longer wasted on anxiety. It was directed toward action, the kind of action that slowly reshapes a life. That evening, standing on his porch as the sun disappeared below the horizon, Michael understood a truth that most people spend years overlooking. Motivation is a visitor. Discipline is a companion. Motivation comes and goes. Discipline stays. Motivation depends on feelings. Discipline depends on decisions. And decisions, repeated often enough, become destiny. For the first time in many years, Michael wasn't waiting for life to change. He was changing the way he lived, one small choice at a time, one quiet discipline at a time. And without realizing it, he had already begun rebuilding the life he thought he had lost. Hashtag part 5, the freedom of letting go. As summer slowly gave way to autumn, Michael noticed something unusual. His life was becoming lighter. Not easier, not perfect, lighter. For years, he had believed that rebuilding meant adding more. More effort, more goals, more achievements, more plans, more productivity, more success. But now he was beginning to suspect the opposite. Perhaps rebuilding was not about adding. Perhaps it was about releasing. The realization came one Saturday morning. Michael was cleaning his garage, something he had postponed for nearly 5 years. Boxes were stacked everywhere. Old furniture, unused tools, broken electronics, dust-covered containers he had not opened in decades. At first, he approached the task mechanically. Move this, sort that, throw away what no longer worked. But then he opened a box labeled office. Inside were remnants of a former life. Business awards, certificates, plaques, photographs from corporate events, documents from projects long forgotten by everyone except him. He picked up one of the awards. 23 years old, a rising manager, the youngest executive in the company. He remembered how important that plaque had once seemed, how desperately he had wanted recognition, how proud he felt when his name was announced. At the time, he thought moments like that would stay with him forever. Yet here it was, buried in a dusty box, forgotten, almost meaningless. Michael sat quietly, holding the plaque in his hands, and a strange question arose. How many things in my life am I still carrying that no longer matter? The question stayed with him, not just in the garage, everywhere. As the days passed, he began noticing invisible forms of clutter. Not physical clutter, mental clutter, emotional clutter, the unfinished arguments he still replayed, the need to be understood, the need to be right, the need to prove himself, the opinions of people he barely respected, old disappointments, old expectations, old fears. It was astonishing. His mind was carrying far more weight than his house. The Buddha often taught that suffering comes from attachment. Most people think attachment means possessions, money, homes, objects, but attachment is much deeper. You can become attached to opinions, attached to identities, attached to expectations, attached to resentment, attached to the story of who you think you should be. And often those attachments become heavier than anything you could hold in your hands. One evening, Michael visited a nearby lake. The water was calm, almost perfectly still. He sat on a wooden bench and watched leaves drift across the surface. One by one they fell, without resistance, without hesitation, without fear. The trees were not fighting autumn. They were participating in it. Nature never seemed to struggle with change. Only people did. A tree does not cling to dead leaves. It releases them, not because it wants to, because it must. Otherwise, new growth becomes impossible. Michael watched another leaf float downward, and suddenly he understood. He had spent years trying to hold on to seasons that were already over. The season of youth, the season of achievement, the season of being needed by everyone, the season of proving himself. Beautiful seasons, important seasons, but seasons nonetheless. And seasons are not meant to last forever. That night, he returned home and began another kind of cleaning. Not the garage, his schedule. He looked honestly at how he spent his days. Some commitments remained simply because they had existed for years. Some relationships survived only through habit. Some activities drained him completely, yet offered nothing meaningful in return. For perhaps the first time in his life, Michael asked a simple question. Does this strengthen my life or weaken it? The answer surprised him. Many things he assumed were necessary were not. Many things he thought were important were merely familiar. And familiarity can be deceptive. People often mistake familiar burdens for essential responsibilities. They carry them so long that they forget what life feels like without them. Over the following weeks, Michael began making small changes. Not dramatic ones, just honest ones. He declined invitations he did not genuinely want to attend. He reduced time spent watching endless news cycles. He stopped engaging in pointless arguments online. He limited conversations that revolved around constant negativity. He organized his home, simplified his routines, protected his energy, and something remarkable happened. His anxiety decreased, not all at once, but steadily, like clouds slowly leaving the sky. He had always assumed peace would arrive by gaining more control. Now he saw that peace often arrived through needing less control. The distinction was profound. Years earlier, he wanted everyone to understand him. Now he simply wanted to understand himself. Years earlier, he wanted everyone to approve of him. Now he wanted integrity. Years earlier, he wanted certainty. Now he wanted presence. The Buddha taught that freedom is not found by controlling the world. Freedom is found by loosening your attachment to it. This does not mean withdrawing from life. It means participating without clinging, loving without possessing, working without obsessing, planning without panicking, caring without controlling. For the first time, Michael began experiencing that freedom. It felt unfamiliar, but beautiful. One afternoon, his daughter called unexpectedly. They spoke for nearly an hour. Nothing important was discussed. No major life decisions. No urgent problems. Just conversation. Simple conversation. When the call ended, Michael noticed something. For years, he had approached relationships with expectations. Expectations created pressure. Pressure created disappointment. Now, he was simply grateful for the moment itself. And gratitude felt much lighter than expectation. Much lighter. As autumn deepened, leaves covered the sidewalks throughout the neighborhood. Every day, more of them fell. Every day, the trees became barer. Yet somehow they also appeared stronger. More honest. More authentic. Nothing hidden. Nothing forced. Nothing pretending to be what it was not. Michael admired that. Perhaps aging worked the same way. Perhaps life was not stripping things away to punish him. Perhaps it was revealing what truly mattered, removing what was unnecessary, exposing what remained. And what remained was surprisingly simple. Health, peace, meaningful relationships, awareness, purpose. Everything else was secondary. As he sat on his porch one evening, watching the wind move through the trees, Michael smiled. For most of his life, he had believed freedom came from acquiring. Now he understood a deeper truth. Freedom often comes from releasing. Releasing expectations. Releasing comparison. Releasing resentment. Releasing the endless need to become someone else. And in that release, life becomes lighter. Not because the world changes, but because you stop carrying what was never meant to be carried forever. And in that growing lightness, Michael felt something he had not felt in many years. Peace. Not the dramatic kind. Not the temporary kind. A quiet peace. The kind that arrives when you finally stop fighting the natural flow of life. And deep inside, he knew another chapter was about to begin. Hashtag part 6. The mind can still change. Winter arrived quietly. The trees stood bare against the gray sky. The mornings were colder now. The days felt shorter. And yet, something inside Michael felt brighter than it had in years. Not because his life had suddenly become easy. Not because all of his problems had disappeared. But because he had stopped fighting reality. For the first time in a long time, He was beginning to work with life instead of against it. One morning, while drinking coffee near the window, Michael noticed an old habit returning. He had been reading an article about people starting new careers in their 60s. Almost immediately, a familiar thought appeared. That's not for me. Then another. I'm too old. Then another. People like me don't change. Years ago, he would have accepted those thoughts without question. They would have become facts. They would have dictated his decisions. And eventually, they would have shaped his future. But now something was different. He paused. He simply watched the thoughts, like clouds drifting through the sky. And suddenly he realized something important. The thoughts were not reality. They were merely visitors. The Buddha taught that the mind is not fixed. It is conditioned. Every thought you repeat becomes stronger. Every belief you feed becomes more convincing. Every fear you rehearse becomes easier to believe. Most people think they are trapped by age, but often they're trapped by repetition. They have spent decades telling themselves the same stories, the same limitations, the same excuses, the same fears. Eventually, those stories begin to feel like identity. Michael understood this deeply now. For years, he had repeated, I'm not good with technology. I'm not disciplined. I'm too late. My best years are gone. He had repeated these sentences thousands of times. No wonder they felt true. But truth and familiarity are not the same thing. Something can feel familiar and still be false. That realization changed everything. A few days later, Michael decided to challenge himself. Nothing dramatic, nothing heroic. He simply signed up for a local community class. The topic hardly mattered. What mattered was stepping into something unfamiliar. The classroom was filled with people of different ages. Some younger, some older. Everyone seemed slightly nervous. And that comforted him, because growth always begins with uncertainty. As the instructor spoke, Michael noticed how quickly his mind wanted to retreat. You don't belong here. You'll embarrass yourself. You're too old to learn this. Again and again, the thoughts appeared, but this time he didn't obey them. He observed them, then continued anyway. And something remarkable happened. By the end of the class, he had learned more than he expected. Not just about the subject, about himself. He discovered that his limitations were often assumptions, not facts. The Buddha compared the mind to a field. Whatever seeds you plant repeatedly will eventually grow. Plant fear, and fear grows. Plant discipline, and discipline grows. Plant resentment, and resentment grows. Plant awareness, and awareness grows. The field itself does not decide. It simply responds to what is cultivated. Michael began looking at his mind differently. Instead of asking, why am I like this? He started asking, what have I been practicing? The answer was revealing. For years, he had practiced worry. He had practiced regret. He had practiced self-doubt. He had practiced comparison. No wonder those habits felt automatic. They were well trained. But if habits can be trained, they can also be retrained. This realization filled him with unexpected hope. Not the excitement of youth. Not blind optimism. Something steadier. Something wiser. Hope rooted in understanding. One evening, he sat quietly beside the fireplace. Outside, snow drifted softly through the darkness. The world seemed calm, almost timeless. Michael reflected on the previous year. The man he'd been 12 months earlier felt strangely distant. That man had believed his life was shrinking. This man was beginning to understand that life was evolving. The difference was not age. The difference was awareness. The body had aged. That was true. The years had passed. That was true. But the mind remained capable of learning, capable of adapting, capable of expanding. And perhaps that was the greatest discovery of all. Growth does not belong to the young. Growth belongs to the willing. As long as there is breath, there is potential. As long as there is awareness, there is possibility. As long as there is life, There's another opportunity to begin again. Michael smiled softly. The fire crackled beside him. The snow continued falling. And for the first time in decades, he no longer felt trapped by the number of years behind him. He felt curious about the years ahead, not because he expected perfection, but because he finally understood something the Buddha had taught long ago. You're not your past. You're not your thoughts. You're not the stories you have repeated for years. You are the awareness capable of seeing those stories clearly. And the moment you see them clearly, you are already beginning to change. That night, Michael went to sleep with a sense of peace, not because he had reached the end of his journey, but because he knew the journey was still unfolding. And that realization alone made the future feel brighter than it had in a very long time. Hashtag part 7. The strength of the final decades. Spring returned. The snow melted. The trees that had stood silent through winter began showing signs of life once again. Small green buds appeared on branches that only weeks earlier seemed lifeless. Michael noticed them during one of his morning walks. He stopped beneath a large oak tree and smiled. Nature never hurried. It never failed. The seasons arrived exactly when they were meant to. And suddenly he wondered why human beings fought so hard against their own seasons. For most of his life, Michael had believed strength belonged to youth. Strength meant energy, speed, ambition, achievement, competition, the ability to work longer than everyone else, to push harder, to climb higher. That was the definition he had inherited from the world. But standing beneath that oak tree, he realized something. Youth had given him energy. Age had given him perspective. And perspective was a different kind of strength, a deeper one. Over the following months, Michael noticed people beginning to seek his advice. It happened naturally. A younger neighbor struggling with a divorce. A former colleague worried about retirement. His daughter facing a difficult decision. Again and again, people came to him. Not because he had all the answers, but because he listened, truly listened. Years ago, Michael would have rushed to solve every problem. Now he simply created space, and often that space was enough. The Buddha taught that wisdom grows from direct experience, not theory, not information, experience. And Michael had lived enough life to understand things that books alone could never teach. He understood disappointment. He understood grief. He understood uncertainty. He understood failure. But he also understood recovery, resilience, acceptance, and peace. One evening, while sitting on his porch, he reflected on all the storms he had survived. The financial crisis that nearly ruined him. The relationship that broke his heart. The years of anxiety. The nights of loneliness. At the time, each challenge felt unbearable. Yet somehow he had made it through. And now, those experiences formed something valuable. Not wounds. Wisdom. The world celebrates youth because youth is visible. Wisdom is quieter. It does not demand attention. It does not need applause. It simply sits calmly in the background, waiting for someone ready to learn. For the first time in his life, Michael stopped wishing he were younger. Not because youth was bad, but because he could finally see the gifts hidden within age. Patience, perspective, emotional stability, the ability to distinguish what matters from what is not. These gifts cannot be purchased. They cannot be rushed. They arrive only through living. The realization brought him tremendous peace. His final decades were not a period of decline. They were a period of refinement. Life was not taking everything away. It was distilling what truly mattered. And for the first time, Michael felt grateful for the years behind him, because they had prepared him for the years ahead. Hashtag part 9. Choosing a new purpose. The question arrived quietly, not during a crisis, not during a moment of suffering, but during an ordinary morning. Michael was sitting on a bench overlooking a small lake. The water was calm. The air was cool. Birds moved across the surface, leaving gentle ripples behind them. For a long time, he simply watched. Then a thought appeared. If my life is no longer about proving myself, what is it about? Years earlier, the answer would have been easy. Success, career, achievement, recognition, providing for his family, building something important. Those goals had guided him for decades. But now many of them had already been fulfilled, or faded, or transformed. And for the first time in his life, he realized something surprising. Purpose changes. The purpose that serves one season of life may not serve the next. A tree does not produce fruit every day of its existence. A river does not flow through the same landscape forever. Everything evolves. Why should purpose be any different? The Buddha taught that suffering often appears when we cling to old forms, old identities, old expectations, old directions. Michael understood now that he had spent years searching for a purpose he had already outgrown. The purpose of building had carried him through one chapter. Now another chapter was calling. Not achievement, contribution, not accumulation, meaning, not proving, presence. Over the next several months, Michael stopped asking, "What can I get from life?" and began asking, "What can I give to life?" The question changed everything. He volunteered at a local community center. Nothing glamorous, nothing impressive. A few hours each week, helping where he could, listening, encouraging, supporting. And strangely enough, those simple moments brought him more satisfaction than many of his greatest achievements. Because purpose is not always found in grand accomplishments. Sometimes it is found in quiet service. Sometimes it is found in kindness. Sometimes it is found in simply being fully present. One afternoon, a younger man approached him after a community meeting. The man seemed anxious, lost, confused about his future. Michael listened patiently, the way others had once listened to him. At the end of the conversation, the young man smiled and said, "Thank you. I really needed that." As Michael walked home, those words stayed with him. Not because they fed his ego, because they revealed something important. His value had never disappeared. It had simply changed form. For years, he had measured his worth by productivity. Now, he measured it by presence. For years, he had measured success by achievement. Now he measured it by contribution. And perhaps that was wisdom, not discovering a hidden purpose, choosing one consciously, choosing how to spend the remaining years, choosing what deserves attention, choosing what deserves energy, choosing what deserves life itself. As the sun began setting over the lake, Michael felt something he had not felt in a very long time. Direction. Not the restless direction of ambition, the peaceful direction of meaning. And for the first time, the future no longer felt uncertain. It felt intentional. Hashtag part 10. Peace is the real success. Years passed. Not many, but enough. Enough to notice how differently Michael now moved through life. The man who once feared aging had become friends with it. The man who once fought change had learned to flow with it. The man who once measured himself against the past had finally learned to live in the present. One evening, shortly after his 70th birthday, Michael sat alone on his porch. The sky was painted with the colors of sunset. Orange, gold, soft shades of purple. The neighborhood was quiet. The same neighborhood he had lived in for decades. And yet it felt different. Or perhaps he was different. As he sat there, memories drifted through his mind. The successes, the failures, the victories, the losses, the people who had come and gone, the dreams that had unfolded, the dreams that had faded. For the first time, he felt no need to judge any of it. No need to rewrite the story. No need to argue with reality. Life had been imperfect and beautiful, difficult and meaningful, painful and precious, exactly as it was. The Buddha taught that peace does not come from controlling life. Peace comes from understanding life. Understanding that everything changes. Understanding that attachment creates suffering. Understanding that every moment is temporary. Understanding that awareness is enough. Michael finally understood. The years behind him were not mistakes. They were lessons. The challenges were not punishments. They were teachers. The losses were not proof of failure. They were reminders of impermanence. And the future was not something to fear. It was simply another chapter waiting to unfold. As darkness slowly covered the evening sky, Michael reflected on the question that had once haunted him. Was it too late? The answer made him smile. No, it had never been too late. The only thing that had delayed his transformation was the belief that transformation required youth. But wisdom had taught him otherwise. Growth belongs to awareness, not age. Peace belongs to acceptance, not achievement. Meaning belongs to intention, not circumstance. And success, real success, has very little to do with what the world celebrates. Real success is waking up without resentment. Real success is looking at your past without regret. Real success is meeting uncertainty without panic. Real success is loving people without trying to control them. Real success is living each day with clarity, with gratitude, with awareness. The world spends so much energy chasing more. More money, more recognition, more approval, more certainty. But eventually life teaches a simpler lesson. Enough is enough. A peaceful mind is enough. A meaningful day is enough. A loving conversation is enough. This breath is enough. Michael closed his eyes for a moment and listened. The wind moving through the trees. The distant sound of birds returning home. The quiet rhythm of his own breathing. Nothing extraordinary was happening, and yet everything felt complete. The years ahead might be fewer than the years behind him, but that no longer felt tragic. It felt clarifying. Every sunrise mattered more. Every conversation mattered more. Every ordinary moment mattered more. Because he finally understood what so many people spend a lifetime searching for. Life was never meant to be conquered. It was meant to be experienced. Not rushed through, not controlled, not possessed, experienced, one mindful moment at a time. And as the last light disappeared beyond the horizon, Michael felt a deep sense of gratitude, not for a perfect life, for a real one, a life that had taught him patience, humility, compassion, awareness, and peace. The peace that comes when you stop trying to become someone else. The peace that comes when you stop fighting the flow of time. The peace that comes when you finally arrive where you already are. If you are listening tonight, perhaps the same invitation is waiting for you. You do not need to become younger. You do not need to reclaim the past. You do not need to prove your worth. You only need to be here. This breath, this moment, this life. And perhaps that is the greatest truth of all. Your life is not ending. It is refining. And if you walk forward with awareness, discipline, purpose, and peace, these years will not be years of decline. They will be years of mastery. And that may be the most beautiful chapter yet.